Okay, hello. We'll give everybody a minute to stream into the room. Got about 83 people so far. Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Reframing the Conversation Around Family Engagement webinar. My name is Lisa Aramoni. I'm Director of Communications for the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement. And we want to start with just a couple of housekeeping items before we get into the webinar. As people join, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know who you are, where you're from, what you do. If you have a question about today's webinar, can you please put it in the Q&A box instead of the chat box, because the chat tends to move very quickly and it's not possible for us to monitor the chat and pull questions from there. We'll be leaving a lot of time for discussion at the end of the presentation, so we really invite you to put all of your questions into the Q&A whenever you think of them. This webinar will be recorded, so we'll be sending that out to all registrants within about a week. And at the conclusion of the presentation, we're going to have a poll pop up, a survey, a satisfaction survey, and we would love for you to hang around for 30 seconds more at the end of our webinar and just give us your thoughts on how we might be able to improve in the future or what you liked and didn't like. And with that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and Vito Borello, Executive Director of the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement.
Great, thank you, Lisa, and good afternoon. We're thrilled that so many of you could join us. Thank you for being part of this webinar on reframing family engagement. We are absolutely thrilled to launch what we call GLR Learning Tuesdays and our partner webinars with the National Association for Family, School, and Community Engagement, or NAFSCE, with my partner Vito, who I'll introduce in a moment. And if we could go to the next slide. Our partnership with NAFSCE has been instrumental in accelerating our work at the campaign around successful parents and our Changing the Narrative work. And we couldn't be more delighted and grateful to be joining forces in moving the field forward around family engagement. Our partner webinars are intended to lift up and share important work that our partners are engaged in and that advances the work of the campaign. In this first partner webinar, NAFSCE will share efforts to reframe the conversation around family engagement so that we see real impact in communities across the country, especially around student achievement gaps. And Vito, I know you'll share more as you introduce the session and our moderator in our panel. But first, let me say a few words about the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for those of you that are not part of the campaign. And if we could go to the next slide. So the Campaign for Grade Level Reading launched in 2010 to disrupt generational poverty by mobilizing communities, and they're represented by all of these stars on the map. We mobilize communities to find solutions for one of the major obstacles in the pathway out of poverty, and that is the failure to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. And what we do is we inspire and motivate these communities to do 3 things to ensure early school success as measured by 3rd grade reading. So the first is to put a stake in the ground around a 3rd grade reading goal that is ambitious, achievable, and actionable. Number 2 is that they develop plans to solve major drivers of the 3rd grade reading proficiency gap. First, too few young children are ready for school. The second driver is that too many students are missing too many days of school. And the third driver is that too many children are experiencing summer learning loss. And then the third thing that are engaged is that they themselves at the level to implement that plan. Most notably, these are data holders, providers of services and supports to families and young children, and most importantly, parents and caregivers. So this map on the screen represents the more than 300 communities that are part of the network and whose work at the local level is advancing our agenda around parent success to advance early school success and ultimately third grade reading. So with that, Vito, I'd love for you to talk about our partnership, starting with many years of work together, but now with this webinar, to share about the work that you've engaged frameworks and so many of us around the country around reframing family engagement.
Thank you so much, Yoli. I want to start by just thanking Ralph Smith and Yoli and everyone at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. We have been working together literally almost since NAFSC's birth. And by the way, we were 5 years old 2 days ago. Hard to believe, but we were founded in September 15th of 2014. And the Campaign for Grade Level Reading and NAFSC have been working on so many of the strategic and systemic issues that we are focused on. That includes working with the Council for Chief State School Officers, and now 17 states who are either in the process of or are already launching birth through grade 12 family engagement frameworks that we really expect now to help states be even more strategic about advancing family engagement within their states. And then as it pertains to this work, reframing the conversation around family engagement. The campaign has been really committed to changing the narrative, and we've been committed to reframing the conversation. And so we've come together around this initiative in partnership with the Frameworks Institute and a number of our funders that we'll talk about in a minute, to help the general public better understand family, school, and community engagement in a way that we hope will advance policy and ultimately also advance practice. So Yoli, again, thank you so much. This is also our first webinar for the fall. We typically have our webinars the fourth Wednesday of the month, but to make this work for both partners, we're doing it today. With that, let me move into talking a little bit about NAFSC, since we have a number of additional folks on the line who are not NAFSC members. And let me just say, this is the spirit and the beauty of partnership. We have 1,240 registrants, by far the largest, I think, that either one of our organizations have ever had for a webinar. And I think it speaks to the relevance and the excitement that people have about this work really transforming the way people think about family engagement.
And it speaks to the power of partnerships.
Absolutely. And so we hope you're all going to take this and you're now going to be empowered to be able to better speak about family engagement. That's what this is all about. Let me tell you a little bit about NAFSC. As I mentioned, we were founded in September of 2014. And I want to speak to our vision, which is around a world where family engagement, a couple of keywords, is universally practiced as an essential strategy for improving children's learning and advancing equity. This is about family engagement for all, but this is absolutely about also closing the achievement gap, and we're very committed to that, and providing access and opportunities so all have the opportunity for the children to be able to succeed in school and in life. In addition to being a membership association, and everyone is invited to become a member if you are a practitioner in the work or a parent leader in the work. We also are focused on advancing the systemic issues, really addressing the systemic obstacles that have gotten in the way of this work advancing. And I mentioned the work that Yoli and the campaign and NAFSC are doing around working with states, but this area around reframing the conversation is significant. And you're going to hear from Frameworks and Sean Adamick what the research tells us and how we need to change the way we speak about it in a way that people will better understand it and embrace it. So with that, I'd like to, if we can move it forward, thank you. I'd like to speak to, so once we had the research, we've been working with Frameworks for 3 years at this point. And I wanna also just thank our funding partners who've enabled this to occur, Heising Simons, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. Had it not been for those 4 organizations, we would not be able to have this webinar today. It's been a huge commitment of time and energy and resources, and we thank them. But once the research was done, we had actually been working together to assemble what we're calling the National Alliance for Family Engagement. research is great, but if there's not an opportunity and you're not thinking strategically about how to advance the research, then we're going to minimize our opportunity for success. And so we assembled, and we're thrilled to have the National Alliance for Family Engagement. You can see there are 20 national organizations who are members. You'll also notice in this slide, it says, join us on the left. This is the steering committee, but all of you, and we are inviting the general public and stakeholders in this work to become part of the National Alliance. And you can go on that website, nationalalliance.nafsky.org, to join, and then we'll give you updates and keep you engaged on the work that's going to be happening over the next couple of years. So with that, Yoli, before we move on to introducing Marissa and Sean, anything else that you want to say?
I think I'll just remind us all that, and I suspect that almost everybody on this call fully embraces the idea that families, parents are so central to the well-being and the success of children. And we've got reams and years of research and evidence, and yet we still see families not being embraced as critical and equal partners in their children's education. And we think it's because we may not be talking about that essential partnership in the way that the public can hear it, that policymakers and especially people in the education system, that they may not be hearing it in the way that is the most compelling and that will drive our actions and our practices in ways that place families at the center. So I'm really excited to hear from Frameworks and the work that they've done to help us really communicate this work in a way that we see the science and the research, really matching up to the practice.
Excellent. Thank you. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two presenters today, starting with Sean Adamick, who's the president of Adamick Communications. Sean is a veteran communications professional working exclusively with mission-driven organizations who seek to make a difference in the world. He has had the honor of working with some of the world's leading advocates, including Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the American Red Cross, City Year, the Henry K. Kendall Foundation, Swanee Hunt Alternatives, the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, and now NAFSky, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and our partners. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Vito.
And then Marissa Gerstein-Pinault is the Senior Associate and Researcher at Frameworks Institute. And Marissa is a researcher and a Senior Associate, bridging the research and research interpretation and applications units. A sociologist by training, she has focused her research on gender and family, medicine, culture, and public policy. Prior to joining Frameworks, she served as a program officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, where she worked with panels of leading experts on a variety of topics. Most recently, she co-edited The Integration of Immigrants into American Society, a comprehensive review of immigrant integration in the United States. Marissa received her BA in sociology from New College of Florida and her MA and PhD in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles. Marissa, welcome.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, Vito. Thanks, Vito. Okay, so that's all the time we have. Sorry, no, I'm kidding. Thanks, everybody, for your attention. My name is Sean Adamick. As Vito mentioned, I am a practitioner. I'm a professional communicator, a writer, a producer, a storyteller. Ultimately, what I do and what I'm doing in partnership with NAFSky is helping to interpret some really exciting research that you're going to hear about today and integrate it into communication strategies for organizations like yours and advocates like you all. So what you're going to hear today, and I'm going to pass it off to the PhD in the room, to the researcher who actually conducted the research and understands it far better than anyone. What you're going to hear is essentially what Frameworks discovered through this research. And what Frameworks does on this issue and on a lot of issues is map the sort of toxic mindset that can exist on issues. And that means the way the public generally thinks and talks about issues and the extent to which those patterns of thinking are productive or not productive. And by that we mean likely to support the kinds of systemic change that we all seek or not likely to support. And then not just identify what those patterns are, but then figure out ways to navigate around them to help people think and access more productive ways of thinking. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to describe what the research found, and then take your questions and have a discussion about how to integrate it. And hopefully you find some useful tips today, and tips that you can bring home to bring back to your offices and to your colleagues, and start integrating it into the way you talk to your stakeholders. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Marissa, who's going to walk through the research.
Okay, thank you everybody for that introduction. My name is Marissa Gerstein-Pinot. I'm a senior associate and researcher at the Frameworks Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that helps other nonprofits and advocates talk about important social issues in more effective ways. And we've been working on this project around reframing the conversation around family engagement for about the past 3 years with, in partnership with NAFSG. So we're very excited to show you our reframing recommendations, including some specific examples of how you can use them in your own work. So to start off with, I just want to talk about what a frame is, because this is a term that's being used more and more often lately, and it often is used in different ways depending on the user. But the way that we talk about frames here at Frameworks is that they're a set of choices that you make about how information is presented. It's what you emphasize, it's how you explain something, it's what you say, and a lot of times it's what you leave unsaid. And a frame effect occurs when making small changes in your presentation leads to measurable, significant changes in people's response to that information. So why is framing so important for all of us? Well, to begin with, it's because we know that understanding is frame dependent. So how information is framed shapes people's understanding of what a particular social problem might be. And this is an example from some different work, but somewhat related in that it is about children specifically, where some advocates who were looking to talk more effectively about children's mental health and raise support for evidence-based policies to address children's mental health came to us because they were really facing a lot of barriers to helping people understand what these policies are and why they were so important. And the research that we did with members of the public showed that there were a number of barriers to understanding and support for policy. So one is that members of the American public tend to think that children don't have mental health. Another is that people usually attribute outcomes for children, including their health and their mental health, specifically to families and to parents. So there's this idea of there being a family bubble that where children's outcomes are really solely due to what parents do as opposed to larger environments, as opposed to policies and programs. So as part of our reframing strategy for that, we tested a number of different values against each other to see which values were the best frames for information about child mental health that would increase sort of people's prioritization of child mental health and their support for evidence-based policies. And we tested a number of values, but these are two of them. And just to explain what you're seeing in this graph, so one group of people got a value of future progress and social prosperity. So essentially the frame here said something like, in order for our country to progress effectively, for all of us to have both economic and social prosperity, we need to be attentive to the needs of children's mental health and therefore support these particular policies. And then another group got a frame of vulnerability. So the basic message there was children are the most vulnerable members of our society, and we need to support efforts to address child mental health because children are so vulnerable. Then the third group are represented by that black line, and they're the control group. So they got no message. And then all three groups were asked to prioritize child mental health against some other important issues, and also asked about their support for those policies. And as you can see here, there were opposite effects from those two frames. So compared to the control group, the people who read that progress and prosperity frame were more likely, statistically significantly more likely, to support evidence-based policies. Whereas the people who got that vulnerability frame, children are vulnerable, we should support, efforts towards child mental health for that reason, this actually depressed their support for evidence-based policies. We would speculate that that's because people are so focused on families being the most important determinants of children's outcomes. So it's hard to see why programs and policies would be important if it's really just all about parents and them controlling sort of the vulnerability of children. So I think this tells you two things. So one is that understanding is frame dependent. The other thing it tells you is that you really need to test your frames to find out which are the most effective. The vulnerability frame is one that was being used throughout the field of child mental health. Advocates thought it would be really effective, and by testing it, we could actually demonstrate that it was doing the opposite of what they intended it to do. So there, is an unintended outcome, which was problematic for the field. So the other reason why framing is so important is that having a shared framing strategy amplifies your message. We find that a lot of times in any particular field, I think this is definitely the case in education, you have a lot of different organizations and groups that have a lot of different messages that are kind of going in different directions. So even though their ultimate goals might be the same, they're saying different things, and it's creating a lot of noise in terms of these different communications that makes it hard for members of the public to understand what the message is. And it also keeps these organizations and groups from actually coming together and organizing jointly across the field. So when you have a shared framing strategy, you can get everybody's messages going in the same direction, which not only cuts down on that noise, but also can really unify a field. And when everybody in a field is using the same message and that message is getting out, that framing strategy at a very high dose, it is much more effective. So organizations tend to come to us when they have what we call the you say, they think problem. So experts and advocates and people who really care about an issue are saying one thing, and then the public seems to be hearing something very different, even if the experts and advocates think what they're saying is completely reasonable and is informed by evidence. So, advocates for engagement might be saying family and school engagement should be relational, intentional, goal-oriented, and continue throughout the year. I think this is a standard message that we heard a lot from experts in our research. But what we heard from members of the public was, that's true. Parents should be monitoring what goes on with their children in school. They should check their homework and go to back to school night, which isn't what the experts are really trying to convey. There's a much more limited understanding of engagement amongst the public, and the onus is really on the parents, and not necessarily without really understanding how this can be intentional and continue throughout the year and be shaped by the education system. So what's getting in between these two messages? What's sort of the barrier between what the experts are saying and what the public is understanding? Well, we would argue that it's culture. So culture really shapes the way that we view the world. It's how we make meaning of the world, and cultural models are these sort of deeply held assumptions and beliefs that are created through years of experience and expectations that are shared because we all live within a society with a shared culture. So, talking to people from all sorts of different walks of life and different places within this country, you'll hear the same cultural models again and again. And they're often very taken for granted. People don't even realize that they're thinking with a particular model. And these are the things that people use to interpret, organize, and make meaning of their experiences, the information they see, and very importantly, your communications. And I do want to note that these our cultural models are widely shared, but also people bring different cultural models to the same pieces of information or to the same issues. And sometimes these models actually sort of run into each other and can be very much in conflict, but people don't even recognize it. They just, it's how they're making meaning of the world. So there's not necessarily one way of thinking of any particular social issue like education or like family engagement. So I'm going to show you a video of the cultural models around family, school, and community engagement sort of in action. These are from interviews that we did on the streets with just everyday people who are walking past in a few different parts of the country. And I think it's a really great illustration of the types of things that you need to be aware of when you're communicating about engagement.
What would you say are some of the most important things like that influence how kids learn?
It depends on the teacher.
The teacher?
Teachers can talk to parents.
Everything, a lot, really depends on what the parents are doing and not doing.
Their parents or other important people in their lives.
Mostly it starts from the parents.
Typically, it's going to be the parents and then teachers at school.
The parents and the teachers and the children.
What role would you say schools have in a child's learning?
Well, for the sort of standard things that children learn, schools are really, really important.
Some of the foundational skills, math, reading comprehension.
Math, reading, stuff like that.
Schools do a great job of providing the core essentials. What about family? What role would you say family plays in kids learning?
I mean, I feel like that's a lot different from classroom learning.
I think that's more maybe emotional learning as opposed to book learning.
Your family teaches you, I think, your morals.
For school, it's more of, you know, like I said, the how to learn, but that doesn't necessarily instill values in the child. That's where the parents come in. How do you think they should engage with each other, schools and families?
I think of like parent-teacher conferences.
PTA, Parent-Teacher Association.
Parent-teacher conference.
Loving teachers.
Have love in their heart.
Being loved and cared for.
Parents taking more interest in their children.
Just encouraging of the education.
I feel like if parents don't care, then you probably won't care that much either.
If the families aren't engaged and, you know, taking interest in their students, like their child's schoolwork, then, you know, child's not going to take interest in it either.
I don't know, it's so hard because some families just like don't get involved with learning.
I feel like that all depends on what community that you live in, because some communities are bad, some are good.
And the suburban families have a tendency to be more involved in the school process than in the city.
What about schools and communities working together? How would you say they engage each other?
You know, I feel like I don't have a lot of knowledge about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm really not sure on that one.
I wouldn't tell you where to begin on that one.
I don't know. I've never really thought of them about working together. I've always thought about them separately.
Nothing really comes to mind for that.
I don't think community plays any role.
So as you saw, there are a number of assumptions, what we call cultural models, that sort of are creating barriers. We would call them the unproductive cultural models that make it difficult for any communications about family, school, and community engagement to overcome. And so the framing recommendations that we make are designed to bridge that gap. But let's focus for a moment on what we saw in that video. So the first was this idea of tangible triad. And so this is that there are these interpersonal relationships amongst teachers, parents, and students, and they're the only ones that really count. So thinking about principals, thinking about other school staff, thinking about community members, thinking about the idea that there could be systems in place to actually create stronger engagement and stronger relationships. It's very difficult to overcome this particular understanding. So the idea of compartmentalized learning, you saw a lot of that in the video where people talked about how schools is where you do academics, and families is where you learn your values and your morals and your social emotional skills. So that also makes it difficult to see how engagement can help children develop critical skills across different locations and across different settings. Traditional engagement, people are very focused on parent-teacher conferences, the PTA, and looking at homework. They also tend to be focused on the idea that the real communication tends to happen when there's at a time of crisis. So that idea that it's this ongoing thing that continues throughout the year is missing from people's understanding of engagement. Caring is everything is a big one to overcome. Although engagement is interpersonal, it is about much more than caring. But members of the public assume that if either the teacher or the parent or the child don't care, then the others aren't going to care either. So if there's not caring there just can't be engagement. You saw some of this idea of the culture of poverty. So the idea that there are certain families or certain communities, and usually these are impoverished and in people's minds highly racialized communities, where families just won't engage. Perhaps they can't for various reasons, but they're sort of lost causes. And then as you saw at the very end, the idea of communities engaging with schools is just out of the picture. People cannot really think of how that might happen. So these are the gaps that we're trying to overcome with our recommendations. So now to get into the recommendations themselves, and I'm going to go through each of them, although I'm going to start by talking about sort of the overall strategy that each of these recommendations are feeding into. So this is what we call the Creating Conditions for Engagement master frame. So the master frame is woven from 3 different strands. The first is that you want to orient people towards equity. So we know that equity is a very important goal of engagement, but people often don't really understand what equity is, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but I think that that's a big part of how we change people's thinking about engagement. The second is explaining the context for engagement. What actually needs to happen and how is it going to happen? So there's a lot of explanatory work that we need to do. And then also illustrating the transformative power of engagement. So letting people know that engagement isn't just worth it for itself, it actually really changes the way in which education works and can transform the way students and teachers and parents, families, schools, and communities interact with each other and, you know, really change education in America in a lot of different ways. So effective framing requires doing all 3 of these pieces, and I'm going to show you the individual recommendations that help you get to this higher level conditions for engagement frame. So we used a number of tactics in this framing strategy, and they each do slightly different work. I'm going to start by talking about values and examples specifically. So what are values? So these are, they're enduring beliefs. They're the things that we believe about our country and that we believe about ourselves as Americans. And what they do is when you're talking about any particular topic, they're going to orient people's attitudes and behavior by telling them why this particular thing matters to that person. Why is this so important? So values are generally used at the beginning of any framing endeavor. Our research found that using the value of opportunity for all communicates the importance of inclusiveness and opens up the discussions about equity that I talked about a moment before as being so critical in terms of moving people's thinking about engagement. So what does opportunity for all look like? So one version of this, very similar to what we tested, was that, you know, we are committed as Americans to making sure that everyone has the same opportunities regardless of the color of their skin, how much money they have, or the language they speak at home. And that's why we need to build strong connections between all families, our schools, and our community. So that's one way that you can use this value to sort of open up a conversation or communication about engagement. And next, you want to use concrete examples and very clear explanation of equity. So equity is such an important goal of engagement, and it's a very important part of the conversation around education in general. But something that a lot of our research has shown is that people don't know what equity is. So, if you're talking about an engagement framework, for instance, as an equitable approach, people just aren't sure what they're supposed to take away from that because they're not sure what equity is. And what we found, fortunately, with our research was that just explaining what equity is in a very clear way goes a very long way to building support for equitable practices. So this is a case where I did sort of a before and after. And in the before, which is on the left hand of the screen, you can see that it's talking about equity-based opportunities and then what they lead to. So they boost culturally relevant instruction and teaching. They contribute to parents being more involved. They help student literacy and social well-being, which is all true and wonderful. But if you don't explain to people how that actually works and leads to those outcomes, people aren't going to be sure what equity looks like in practice. So I reframed this with an explanation of equity, which starts with talking about the fact that there are barriers for some families to engage with schools, and gives some of those specific barriers so that people understand what equitable practices are overcoming. So school events are scheduled for times parents can't get there. Parents and teachers might not speak the same language. Of course, there are many, many more, but these are just two examples. So in order to promote engagement, schools need to create practices that actually address these particular barriers. So translating materials, holding events at different times, that allow all families to be involved. So now people understand what this equitable approach is because they know there are barriers, they know that specifically what those barriers are, and then what the equitable practices are that address them. And then at the bottom, I talk about the outcomes. So by overcoming these obstacles, you can create, higher attendance rates, more participation, and more volunteerism. So the information that was on the left is great information, but it needed explanation to set it up, or people are not going to understand what equity actually looks like. So here's just a short example of how you compare that value of opportunity for all with equity in a tweet. So even in a very small amount of space, you can do great framing. So talking about how all kids should have the opportunity to succeed, and that equitable family engagement practices break down the barriers that families face. So again, just giving people a little bit more explanation about what equitable practices do is really helpful. So I really like to always offer people a smaller, a shorter version of how you can frame, because I don't want anybody to be discouraged by the thought that, well, the only way I can reframe this relatively small piece of information is by doing all this extra work. You can actually do it in a very, short, small amount of text. So the next value that we recommend is the value of interdependence. We found that this value, and I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, was particularly helpful in helping education practitioners, so teachers and principals and vice principals, see engagement as something that can be systematic and brings community into the picture. So an example of what you're telling practitioners is that in our community, we all rely on one another. So everyone has stake in the success of the children of our schools. And this is why we need engagement to ensure children's success. And part of what interdependence is doing is it's helping overcome practitioners' hesitation about engagement practices creating more work for them. So setting it up with a value of interdependence and this idea that actually we're all relying on one another, and that teachers can rely on parents and on community members as well, helps sort of short circuit that type of thinking about it being a burden. And it also plays on thinking that education practitioners have, which is that schools themselves are sort of a form of family, and the family members of their children are part of that larger family. So talking about interdependence also helps them think about that particular way that they conceive of their school. So it's very helpful in that way. So next I'm going to move on to the explanatory metaphor engagement, and I'm really excited about this one because it's a really interesting metaphor that I think is going to be really useful and has a lot of different possibilities for all of you to use. So let me just start really quickly by talking about why a metaphor. We know that metaphors are a really strong way of shaping thinking. Actually, people, all of us, think in metaphors all of the time. And it's because it takes something that's very familiar and compares it to something that is unfamiliar. So in this case, this is a metaphor that we developed to talk about early childhood brain development, which is the idea of brain architecture. So taking construction and building a building, which is something that all of us, at least, in theory, know about. We know that houses are built. We know that you need a strong foundation. We know that you put up support beams, and talking about the development of the brain in that way. So young brains need a strong foundation. They need support beams that go up over time, etc. So this is the type of thing that metaphors do very successfully in terms of helping explain things people don't necessarily understand well. So in the case of this project, the metaphor that we're recommending is the idea of space launch. This is very successful in helping people understand how engagement happens. And I'm going to show you a way of sort of mapping the space launch metaphor. So from the idea of a space launch on the left to engagement on the right. So talking about planning a launch, that's setting goals at the beginning of the year. So talking about mission control and this group of experts that have different forms of expertise coming together to actually put together the launch and send the astronaut or the rocket into space is like family, schools, and communities. Working together in both cases, it's very clear that collaboration is key. Planning early for a space launch is similar to starting in early childhood or starting early in the school year. And then talking about how you've launched a rocket or an astronaut, mission is accomplished. The equivalent in terms of engagement is that students have healthy development, they have student success. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos. This first one I'm going to show you is a before and after of a person we spoke to on the street talking about engagement before he heard this metaphor, and then talking about engagement after he heard this metaphor.
So as far as schools and families working together, what would you say that looks like?
I mean, there's only so much one can do. I mean, there's so many families that you would have to work with, and that'd be a massive overhaul.
How would you say schools and communities work together?
I don't know how I would have communities and schools directly interact, but maybe there should be something there. I'm not entirely sure.
So I'm curious what you took away from that.
Boom. That's it. I mean, that's what I've been saying. Everything's connected. We all work together. Everybody wins. Okay. As if we all help each other up. We pull each other's bootstraps.
How would you say that affects children's learning?
I would say it'd be a very healthy relationship because, for one, everybody's pooling their resources to fuel our future. Our children are our future. But at the same time, it shows kids that, hey, if we work together, we can get stuff done. We can make this world just a little bit better every day.
So the thing I love about that video is that, you heard it but in the before footage that this gentleman wasn't sure how you could talk about community engagement. He also didn't really think that engagement was possible because you'd have to reform the entire educational system. And then after the metaphor, he actually goes, boom, that's exactly what I was saying. which actually was not what he was saying before, but the metaphor did such a good job of moving his thinking that he actually thought it was something he was saying before, that he was thinking before. So that shows sort of the power of that metaphor in terms of helping explain what engagement is, why is it important, and what actually needs to happen for effective engagement. So next I'm going to show you a video from Ohio, from their State Family Engagement Center, which immediately started using the space launch metaphor after we first released it publicly, and did just a fantastic job of integrating it into their video.
Welcome to the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center website. We know that Ohio's children succeed when families, schools, and communities work better together. Helping our kids succeed is like working at NASA's mission control. Just like a space launch needs astronauts, scientists, and mathematicians to work together, we need schools, families, and communities to work together to help student learning take off. Everybody has a part to play if we want to have a successful launch. Ohio's families are diverse. We have families with different strengths and challenges from different cultures and histories who speak different languages and who have different abilities. This website is for all of us. We created this website for every child, every family, and every school because everyone deserves an opportunity to benefit from the best resources available. All kids deserve the opportunity to succeed, and that happens when families, schools, and communities work together.
So as I said, that's just a great example of using that space launch metaphor along with some graphics and doing a wonderful job of explaining what engagement actually looks like. So thank you to the folks from Ohio for putting that together already. I'm really excited to have it. So now on to some of our other framing recommendations that are part of the overall strategy. So next I'm going to talk about messengers, and I'm going to talk about benefits messages. So this is particularly, I think, part of that idea of transformation, and gets more explicitly to the ways in which engagement can really transform education and transform the lives of teachers and students and parents. So the first, so kind of actually in combination, the first big recommendation from this section is that you want to foreground the benefits to teachers and to students. And then second, you want to have parents talk about how engagement benefits them. So this is an example of it could be a Facebook post or something on your website where you talk about teacher benefits. I do, want to say it's very interesting. When I did research looking at a lot of different websites amongst organizations working on engagement, there is a lot more focus on the benefits to students, which our research shows is a very good way to raise support for engagement. So, but we were surprised that talking about benefits for teachers does just as well, if not better. So I definitely recommend not just sticking with benefits to students, but talking about benefits to teachers as well. And this is just an example of how you might do that. So these are a number of different benefits that you can talk about for teachers of having effective engagement. So it improves teacher performance because parents are reinforcing lessons, increases test scores, it could lead to pay increases, improving student attitudes and reducing behavioral problems, which can increase retention. So this idea that these are, when you have engagement, it's a collective benefit across all the different groups that are engaging, I think is part of that transformational story, and something that people just get, when they think about engagement, have a hard time sort of expanding their ideas about what those collective benefits could be. So using teacher benefits, I think, is a really interesting way and useful way to do that. So our other finding about benefits was that when you talk just about benefits to parents, it wasn't as powerful in moving people's support for engagement as talking about teacher benefits and student benefits. But then what we did find is that when you have a parent talking about parent benefits, it actually works very well. So this is an example I designed. I realize that Facebook doesn't really use this format anymore, but bear with me, about a woman talking about, as a parent, engagement really helps her because she feels empowered. She can connect more with her son and daughter because they have these conversations at home where she really understands what's happening at school. It also has created connections with other parents and led her to community resources as well. So, you know, talking, if you want to amplify a discussion about the benefits for parents, having a parent themselves be the messenger for that particular message is a really great way to do that. So this is the overall framing strategies. Here's all of the different pieces. I'm just going to go through them very quickly to remind you. So one is using the opportunity for all value to set up the discussion about why engagement is so important. Using concrete examples and very clear explanations of what equity is, so people support equitable practices. Using interdependence to help the practitioners in particular understand and value engagement as being something systemic and as being something that helps them as well as students, families, and communities. Use the explanatory metaphor of space launch to explain to people how engagement happens. And again, I recommend watching that Ohio video. And then in terms of benefits, foregrounding benefits to both teachers and students, and having parents advocate for parental benefits. So I'm just going to end on this quote, which we love to use at Frameworks, which is that a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. And I want to thank everybody who has joined this webinar, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, thanks, Marissa, and thanks everybody for your patience. I wanted to, before we open it up, and let me preface that by saying we have a couple of questions already in the Q&A, and I want to invite you all, if you have questions that you'd like Marissa or I or any of the panelists to talk through, please use the Q&A tab. So go down to that taskbar. In fact, you see it on your screen right now at the bottom on your Zoom. It will actually, yeah, on your Zoom, you will see it at the bottom. Just put the cursor over the little window where you're seeing the slide. It will pop up. The same sort of taskbar where you see the chat icon, there's an icon called Q&A. Click on that, put your questions in there, and we will use that list to you know, from which to get questions to answer. So before we do that, I wanted to bring into the conversation a couple of your colleagues, a couple of folks in the field who are in the position to use some of this research for their own purposes and in their own advocacy work. So I want to introduce Oscar Cruz. He's the Executive Director of Families in Schools, as well as Meredith Wellman, who is the project lead at the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center, who are the creators of that great video that you just saw, as well as Barbara Boone, who is the director of the family engagement programs at the Ohio Statewide Family Engagement Center. So let me just start off this brief sort of discussion among these colleagues. I know you see Kwesi Rollins up on the screen. Last minute he was unable to join us, unfortunately, but we're glad to have the folks that we have. Let me just get your reactions. What do you find most useful, most applicable of these findings that Marissa just shared in your own work? Oscar, why don't you start us off?
I'll start. And before I start, just thank you so much to NAFSCI and the campaign for grade level reading. It's amazing the kind of work that this is giving us in terms of the findings. And I really think that we're at a very interesting point in the family engagement field. I really feel like we're in a renaissance. There's been a lot of milestones and you know, from the new wave of evidence, from research, from dual language, the dual capacity framework. And we're entering this moment where we're now starting to think more collectively about the messaging, right? Which is the purpose of this. So I find that very interesting and very relatable to what Families in Schools has been working on. And the things that resonate to me are two things. One, this notion of the technical aspect that it takes to actually do authentic family engagement well, but also at the same time, the equity that has to be grounded within that. In California, we've seen a significant growth of investment in family engagement under our new local control funding formula. And districts started to do a lot of hiring, parent-centered coordinators, community liaisons, you know, community reps. And one of the things we found interesting was that as they were hiring these individuals, there was a lack of training and professional development on saying, well, what does it look like and how do we do it well? So this notion about there's skills that need to be had, right? That there's actual knowledge and competencies that have to be developed. From the framing, I think reflects really well with what Families in Schools has been doing. So a lot of the work that we've been doing with districts has been professional development on developing similar skills across staff that are leading family engagement. But not forgetting that it's not just about the skills component, but it's also a recognition and a discussion around the equity and the obstacles the families face, having open conversations. So from the immediate reaction that we were looking at this, we really felt that this was raising both at the same time, this notion of the technical component and also equity, which I think is going to help us move away from just random acts of kindness to something that says, you know, this has to be systematic. It has to be across the board, and we cannot ignore equity as a component. So some initial thoughts.
Yeah, Marissa and Sean, we clearly love the work that you did, and it was so thorough, and we were excited to jump right on board, and hence, you know, the video right away. But we really think that this helps us to disrupt a cycle that we have been in so many of our conversations, whether they're with families or they're with school personnel as we're doing professional development, that the idea that families don't care, that certain teachers don't care, that this is just sort of a natural process, there aren't skills involved. And so it doesn't matter sort of how many research articles I quote, how much we really lean in and try to share policies and legislation with folks. We felt like we just continued to circle around similar things in your explanation of it being culture. And it's not, it's just sort of a way that we think about things that has sort of set. And so it helps us to disrupt that. And we think about in our work that we like to take research and bring it to reality. You know, we want to take the good things that we know and help change people's lives and improve people's lives. And I think you're helping us make that step with this. You're helping us take what we know, the skills, the knowledge we have, this wide sort of collective effort across the country and to be understood. We want to see people talking about family engagement and valuing it at kitchen tables and staff rooms, in the coffee shops. You know, we'd love for this just to be sort of change that culture and change the conversation.
I'm interested, you know, so much of what Frameworks does can be counterintuitive, particularly to people who communicate about this stuff, not just family engagement, but the number of issues that Frameworks has done research on. A lot of the findings often can be counterintuitive and have the effect of advocates having a sort of palm to forehead moment, like, uh-oh, that's what we've been saying. We've been swimming in that swamp, you know, for a while. Meredith, I'm wondering, as you engaged with the research, were there any of those moments for you, you know, surprising moments or things that, you know, you wouldn't have expected?
Yeah, I think that this metaphor wasn't something we had really thought to use before. I think as Barb mentioned, we've tried a lot of different ways to talk about the importance of family engagement, but I find myself trying new and different ways now and really going back to the frameworks strategies, the opportunity for all. Anytime I come up against a place where I'm like, oh, I need to message directly to teachers, I find myself, every time I hear versions of this presentation, I screenshot what she has on the screen because they're great, just sort of quick places to start for our messaging. As soon as we really heard the framework's research findings at the national conference in Reno this year, we told them that we want to pilot this work. We were about to launch our new website, and so we wanted to embed this message of it's like mission control, there are benefits for teachers and students, the idea of it being important beyond the elementary years, all those things that we try and say over and over again. Clearly, this is a great research-based way to do it. So we're excited to be at the forefront of rolling out this work. And yeah, that it wasn't something that we had thought of before, to use that metaphor.
Oscar, as you think about, I mean, you could see over, I think 1,200, registrants for this webinar. This is a big field, and it's a growing field, and you work with a lot of the voices and faces in this field. What advice would you have for folks who may be in a position to adopt and adapt these findings and put into their own strategies?
When I first saw the metaphor, I really feel that this was needed in the field. This was needed tremendously. I remember an instance when in California, we were advocating for family engagement to be part of a state policy. And I visited an assembly member's office, and we were trying to convey the importance around family engagement. And the assembly member said to me, but Oscar, what can we do? I can't pass a law to tell parents to care for their children. And at that moment, I realized that I was not using the right wording or the right things to help her understand what my messaging was. And that I was really focused more on what speaking to the choir, right? And how do I engage others who are not living family engagement day to day? So I think as we start thinking about how do we use this, I really would advise how do we adapt it to the communities that we're serving and which audiences we want to talk about. For me, I think when I saw this, the first thing that came to mind is this would be a great tool for me to talk to those folks again, decision makers, maybe folks more at the administration, district level, corporate and other organizations that are not living family engagement on day to day, but I need to find a bridge to communicate to them. So we're still going through that process of making that mapping about where does it not make sense for us to use this metaphor, right? Or the framing or parts of the framing. So I think it takes a little while to kind of make sense and adapt it to each organization's reality.
That makes perfect sense. And Barbara, Meredith, before we open it up to the field, any advice you'd offer your colleagues?
Well, I'll jump in. Oscar's trying to figure it out, and we are too. And just jump in. It's funny. I joke that with folks here at Ohio State that my whole family knows this because I practice it at the dinner table, and we practice it around our staff meetings. Because it's interesting to me. I have often had a hard time telling people outside of work what I do at work. When I'm just hit up in the grocery store on the side of a cross-country meet, someone says, "So what do you do?" And I find I'm stumbling, and I have such a better response now. I feel like I get right there, and they're like, "Of course, that's such important work that you do." So I feel like you've really helped us to, be understood, and it's exciting. And we're using it in speaking engagements and websites and in materials that we're printing, and just in so many ways integrating this messaging. We haven't had to change really what we're saying. We're just including these messages so that we are understood and it's more powerful.
That's great. That's great. Okay, let me turn
Sean,
now.
do you mind?
Yes, go ahead.
Sean, do
Oscar.
you mind if I just I had a
Please.
couple other points I wanted to make sure to convey because this is so important. I really wanted to convey the notion about the equity that that it is front and center in the framing, and at least for families in schools. And my reaction is the process of adapting it, we felt that we needed to go deeper in the conversation on how do we tackle about that. So if we stay with the framing around or the metaphor around mission control and launch, you know, what's the biggest thing that a spaceship is trying to fight against is gravity, right? Everybody comes together to try to fight against that gravity that is keeping it the same. We're starting to think too about how do we talk more directly about those forces that we find in our systems that keep status quo. And some of it we have to talk very directly about systems of oppression, things about inequity, thinking about unconscious bias. And I think that we still can use the metaphor and adapt it at each other, you know, with, you know, in each of our environments. And lastly, I think it's messaging, right? At the end of the day, what happens on the ground on the day-to-day level has to reflect what the messaging. And I think that's where it's going to be the real success would look like, is if we're talking about equity in the messaging component, it has to be seen very clearly in the day-to-day work. So thank you.
Great points. And there are some questions about equity that I want to get to as well in the Q&A box. And again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom box. We're going to use the last few minutes here, 18 minutes, to get to as many of these as we can and bring Marissa back in, and Yoli and Vito. And there are some high-level questions here. There are some sort of in the weeds, grassroots questions here. Let's start in the weeds just for a moment. Marissa.
Yes.
You and I have rolled out frameworks research to a number of groups on a number of issues, and there is the very standard, very understandable and justified skepticism about methodology, about, you know, where was this done, what cities was this done in, where, how old is the research? Can you give a sort of, you know, broad summary just to reassure folks about the methodology and really how sound these findings are?
Yeah, so I think, so Vito mentioned at the beginning that I'm a sociologist, and I work with a whole group of social scientists from a wide range of disciplines. And so we use social science methods to create our framing strategies. And these are really, so it takes about 2 years for an entire project. And so we've conducted this research mostly over the past 2.5 years. And we start off with qualitative research, so these in-depth interviews that we actually did with members of the public, educational practitioners, and education policymakers, including state superintendents, to find out how they think about, on a very deep level, what are their assumptions and their expectations about engagement that, you know, could potentially really help conversations about engagement, or more likely and more often are preventing people from understanding engagement the way that advocates want them to understand it. So that was sort of the basis, finding out what are these gaps between expert knowledge and advocate knowledge, and the people they want to communicate to. And then we use that body of research to start creating the framing tools that would address what those gaps are. And so you saw those traps in public thinking. It's also very similar traps with practitioners and also with policymakers that we knew we wanted to address. And then in the second phase of the research, we did a combination of qualitative and quantitative research. So those interviews you saw on the streets are an important way for us to sort of narrow in on particularly metaphors that we think might be useful. And then we tested the metaphors and all the other frames that you saw against a bunch of other frames that didn't do well in a large scale demographically representative survey of Americans, of almost around 6,000 Americans. And so all of the ones we recommended were ones that did very well across the board. And one thing that has come up several times, and that I think is important to talk about, particularly is that we're talking about equity in this project, is that the metaphors and values and everything else did very well across racial and ethnic groups and across lines of social class. So because of, I don't want to get deep into statistical analysis, but because some of these sample sizes are very small for certain groups, they didn't reach a level of statistical significance, which is sort of, you know, a gold standard for us to say something something worked well. But actually, even with those small sample sizes, opportunity for all and the metaphor did very well across the board and were sometimes statistically significant for respondents of color and for lower income groups. So we feel very confident that these are winning frames that are going to do a lot of the work that you need them to do. And we also did some other additional research after that with members of the public and with practitioners to further test these frames. And as I said, the metaphor in particular just hit it out of the park. And I'm really excited to see how people use it creatively.
Sean, I'd like to just speak to something that Marissa said so that everyone can kind of understand the depth and the intentionality that NAFSC and its partners took in working with frameworks. From conducting research with the general public to practitioners, to policymakers, and to experts in the work. It happened at every level. And then we added, as Marissa said, we added a couple things. We know that primarily because teachers aren't prepared to engage families before the end of the classroom, and many of you have heard me say this, teachers become principals and principals become superintendents, and superintendents become state commissioners and state commissioners become secretaries of education. And at many levels, they've not truly been prepared to engage families as strategic partners to their child's education. And so we knew that in addition to the typical process that frameworks goes through, we wanted to add a couple of additional tests. So we actually engaged 8 state education commissioners, state chiefs, who participated in 1-hour interviews, for example, so that we could understand, and federal policymakers, so that we could understand not only bottom up, but top down, how is everyone understanding family engagement, so that we can listen to all of this and we can really create and craft a messaging campaign that will resonate not only with the general public, but will resonate with those policymakers that have the greatest influence on advancing policy.
Great. Okay, so I want to get to this equity question. There are a couple of them in here, and I want to try to combine them if I can. There is frequently questions about how universally applicable research like this can be, right? When there are such disparities among the public, particularly in issues related to family engagement, when there are such disparities between school districts. Marissa, can you start the conversation to talk about the, Oscar, I thought, did a great job starting us off. Can you talk about how this applies to the issue of equity? And there's even a comment in here about the opportunity for all value that, how can you say that? Not all have opportunity, right? So speak to that.
So I saw that comment about how can you say, people all have opportunities, and I just want to make sure that understanding what the frame is, which is it's telling people not that everybody has opportunities, but that everyone should have these opportunities. And because, the idea of this being a land of opportunity, this is sort of a deeply ingrained idea in American culture that this is a place where, everybody should have opportunities. Whether or not they do is another question, but it brings people into that discussion of engagement and does really set up the idea of equity, and that when you have an equitable approach, it is offering these opportunities to everyone by overcoming the barriers of language or not having the time to come into school because you're working 3 jobs, et cetera, and that then ends up with equitable outcomes because people have these equitable opportunities. So that's the intention of those frames. And this is also, I think, one of the things about those 2 frames is that it does set up the conversations about disparities, racial and ethnic inequality, the discussion of gravity that I absolutely love, Oscar. Thank you for bringing that up. I think we have to integrate that into the recommendations that we're making as ways to talk, to then lead into space launch and talk about systems of oppression and structural inequality. So I think, as I said at the end of my presentation, you know, these frames, you want to stay close to sort of the core of the frames, but they're also there for you to be creative and flexible with.
Yeah, I think that can't be emphasized enough. The importance of this work is not that not that it provides a script for everyone in the field to keep in their pocket and pull out whenever you're talking about engagement, or language that is expected to be cut and pasted into whatever assets you're creating. It is meant to be adaptable. You all speak to different audiences. You speak in different environments. You speak through different media. You speak in different contexts. And so even the metaphor, where it can feel like a script, use these words, what's more important is the concept behind it. And it's funny. I'm looking at the Q&A and I'm seeing some following Oscar's great direction that Oscar, you went with the metaphor. There are some folks trying it out even more, right? Can you go this direction with the metaphor? Can you go that direction? And the answer is almost universally yes, right? If it feels like you're getting too deep in the weeds of the metaphor, like if it feels like you're stretching it too far, it means it's working, right? And that you're using it in a dynamic way. The other thing I'll say, because and there are questions here about use of the metaphor, is that and audience, right, of this sort of framing. It is less important to worry about whether or not your audience likes the metaphor. In other words, would respond favorably to the use of it or negatively to the use of it. It's less important about that than it is whether your audience understands it, right? Whether it works. Great example is, there's an education metaphor that Framework came up with, that to describe the education system as an orchestra. And there was some feedback, right? And, south side of Chicago, some areas that, the advocates from those areas saying, you're not gonna come to my neighborhood and use orchestra, right? These people have never seen an orchestra. Okay, but they know what one is. And that's the point, right?
Sean, let me just add that in LA, when Vito and I were in a focus group type of an environment and we were sharing these early findings, parents there actually liked the metaphor of an orchestra and suggested that, and didn't quite like the metaphor of mission control. So
and this was first generation immigrant parents.
Right. So I think it's what the point here that is so critical is that you've got to bring the right metaphor to the kinds of families and sort of the cultural context in which you are working. And I think many of us pay attention to that. So the recommendation here is that, be flexible, to use the flexibility that the recommendations provide to bring a metaphor that makes sense in the way that mission control makes sense to some and orchestra to others.
And if I may, Sean, I think there was another question on the Q&A forum regarding resources, which I think ties beautifully to the issue of equity, because if we understand that some families have more obstacles in front of them than others, sometimes you need more resources to do the things to give everybody the right opportunity to be able to participate, as simple as translation, right? Many districts are in environments where they don't have enough resources, right? But if we really want to create the right opportunities for everybody to be able to engage and recognize that some families have obstacles that they need to confront, we're going to have to change the way the money is being spent, because we're going to have to go get more money for family engagement. So it's invested into that. So I think it also is a way to allocate additional resources, because it is going to take additional different type of work to reach everybody and give them the right opportunity.
Sean, I think if I may, that this is a perfect segue, knowing we've got 5 minutes before we end here. So what's next? This is the beginning, not the end. And so we're working with the Frameworks Institute and our partners to create a toolkit that you'll hear about over the next 3 months. We are conducting already 5 reframing institutes. They're going to be learning institutes already in 5 states. We've got them already planned for Connecticut and Ohio and Massachusetts and Maryland and Pennsylvania. We are presenting this also, I think, at the National Center for Family Learning's conference in November. So we are really thinking about how we can engage states and communities and provide them the tools to be able to really take this, because it isn't about just a slogan. It's really about understanding how you communicate, utilizing these tools in a way that helps people to better understand the work. So you're going to be hearing a lot more about this. And I know there's been a link that Lisa's put in the chat box, but maybe Lisa, if we could do it again, so that anyone who wants to join the National Alliance, we invite you to do so, and there you'll receive the tools that you desire to be able to advance this work.
Yes, so nationalalliance.nafsky.org, please go there and keep checking it, right? There are some questions here in the Q&A. How do we roll this out to our people? How do we use this? How do we, introduce these guidelines to our stakeholders and our messengers? The answer is, we have got your back. We are creating resources, literally as we speak. We are creating resources, and as Vito said, they will be put into a toolkit in a dynamic and navigable way, right? So you can use them, take them, upload them, download them onto your, to share. They'll be shareable, and they will be variable in form, right? They're going to take a number of different forms. So as helpful as we can be to help spread this stuff, we want to be.
So Sean, because I keep seeing this question come up, for everyone who registered, even if they weren't able to come onto the webinar, because we had over 1,000 registers, we will be following up to every single person with a resource document that will include the slides, the links to all the resources, to the videos, the how to get in touch with NAFSCI around the toolkit. So we want to arm people with all of the resources that we've been talking about today.
The last 60 seconds, I want to, Marissa, there are some questions about impact, right? Have there been a breakthrough moment? Have they, how do we know this is working? It's early, right? The quick answer is we don't, but I want to ask you, what are some indicators of success? How should we know it's working?
So, I mean, usually as you said, it's not immediate. And one thing that we found is it often takes many years for a particular framing strategy to really change the way people think and talk about a particular issue. And our early childhood development work is a great example of that, where, now people do understand brain development in early childhood in a very different way, but it's been about 20 years that people have been using those frames. I think the way to make these things work the fastest is to have everybody in the field sharing the same framing strategy and to use it over and over again. Because we know that framing works best in large doses. And so if you remember those arrows that we're all moving together, if everybody is using the same frames and it cuts out that noise and people are seeing the same ways of talking about engagement in place after place after place, that's how you get the biggest bang for your buck, and that's how you move things forward the fastest.
I want to thank our panelists. In the last 30 seconds before you sign off, please use the evaluation that you just saw pop up on your screen. It helps us plan for future events. So please take 30 seconds to do that. I want to thank our panelists, thank our participants, and wish everyone a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care.